In most mediums of entertainment, it's actually quite difficult to outline what makes a well-written character in any medium of entertainment, whether it's manga, whether it's movies, whether it's webtoons, you name it. People may agree on which characters are well written and which ones are not, and sometimes there may be reasons, but there's no real criteria for what will make a well-written character. However, there's usually a few things that these types of characters have in common. One, they seem to play on a theme of some sort, and they play into that theme very well. Other times it's just how complex they are in terms of they actually feel like a real character you love or hate. Other times it's just how simple they're and evil or good they are that makes people far more drawn to them. And in this video I am going to actually just outline my reasons for why I think Fay Wangfang, Edward Wu, and Zai Ji are fairly well written characters by at least Kengan standards. I think they're the best villains that the Kengan verse has seen thus far. We'll see if they ever get beaten in the future, but I will be providing my justifications for why I think they clear the bar. But before we get into that, don't forget to like and sub. I cover this type of Kengan content all the time. I will be doing more theory and analysis type of videos, so be on the lookout for those. Also, disclaimer, I will be talking about spoilers from the manga, so if you haven't actually read it, this is your chance to just straight up click off. But to determine whether or not these are well-written characters by Kengan standards, let's say, it's important to understand how Kengan Ashura and Kengan Omega characters are written in terms of protagonist and antagonist. So we do know protagonists are characters that tend to push the narrative forward and are usually the focus of the story, whereas antagonists, they go against the protagonist basically. Though that's the type of role that antagonists have. They can be straight up evil, but they don't necessarily. And in Kengan Omega and in Kengan Ashura, characters are never, or usually are never straight up evil. There's never really a good versus evil dynamic in the Kengan series. What we typically have is a battle of character, where one person's character is just better than another. Maybe one character is more, you could say, righteous and complete, whereas the other one has crippling flaws that affect them in the fight. And usually that's what determines who will win in the fight. If you actually read or reread, or if you watch the Kengan Omega anime, you rewatch the fights, typically the character that has the better character will win. So let's make a pretty good example here with Setsuna and Kuroki. Kuroki, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much a complete character from the moment he enters the story. There's really no flaws or anything for Kuroki to more or less overcome in the course of Kengan Ashura. Whereas, for example, someone like Setsuna, he has crippling flaws. He's obsessed with someone like Oma and using him to meet his own goals of having a sort of righteous death by Oma's hands. At least in Kengan Ashura, that was Setsuna's goal. So when Kuroki faces off against a character like that, his character shines all the more brighter for its completeness, that really Setsuna has next to no hope to beating him in the end. And I think when you look at the Kengan or the Kengan Annihilation Tournament in Kengan Ashura through that lens, all of Kuroki's wins can be viewed in this light. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that Kuroki was the one who ended up beating, say, Oma. Even though Oma had developed a lot of character in that moment and he had grown much more in comparison to how he was at the beginning of the series, his character is still technically incomplete. we still didn't know at that point in time where Tiger Nico was, why he was chosen so quickly. All of these other loose ends that Kengan Ashura left open really did affect Oma to such an extent where he just wasn't complete as a character. And when faced with a character that is complete like Kuroki, it just goes to show that, Kuroki not only has the power edge, but he also has the character edge. If we take this methodology and also apply it to, say, Kengan Omega, we see it all the more, actually. For example, I don't think it's a coincidence that characters like Lolong and Jurata, characters that were so powerful that they were losing some of their humanity, right? They have, their strength have kind of crippled their characters, right? And so them losing, it does show that, they have more to develop towards. But it also shows that their opponents just seem to have the edge on the character front, and even sometimes in the power front as well, in the case of Lolong and Oma. What I'm trying to show here is that this methodology for characters, the character of a fighter contributing to whether or not they win, isn't something that starts with Omega. It goes way back to Ashura as well. And once there is a sort of understanding of this concept, Fay, Eddie, and G's downfall is sort of predictable, but also once you take the time to reread their character arcs, their flaws are just so much more apparent, and that's what I'll be going through rather quickly. Now, I have done specific videos on Fay, Edward, and G, which will be in the description, so I won't go too in depth on this one. I'll be rather quick, to be honest, and I'll be dealing with the overall theme, right? I won't go into specifics, just to show my point on the fact that they have crippling character flaws and how that contributes to them losing by Kangan standards, right? And why this character flaw is not just in my head, but it's actually something that has been hinted at in the story itself. And we'll start with Fay Wangfang and his crippling character flaw, which is basically Fay's lack of identity as a person. Meaning that really, when you think about it, Fay is running after an identity that he can never really assimilate into. When he's introduced into the story, his face is black. You might think, yeah, they were hiding his identity. However, when he reveals himself as, of course, Nico's student, he introduces himself by saying he is the tiger's vessel. Even though that chapter, that reveal, is one of the most hype reveals in Kengan Omega, it's also one of the most ironic because, to put it quite simply, we now know that Fay could never become the tiger's vessel because Oma is the tiger's vessel. The criteria to be the tiger's vessel is literally being the clone of the second connector, nothing else. Meaning that Nico was dangling a goal in front of his students that he knew they could never get to, right? Fay realizes at the very end of his life, he puts two and two together that, he had been played by Nico, but Fay also contributed when it came to him actually being played, where before he even got to this tournament with Purgatory and revealing his identity, Nico did tell him that, hey look, it's okay to stop. You could just not listen to the orders. It seems like as though whatever we were doing is done, right? You can get to have a life. You have friends at Purgatory, right? Nico asks him this question, whether or not Fay has an identity outside of just trying to become the tiger's vessel. And in that moment, we see the true colors of Fay. He doesn't care about his identity with the people of Purgatory at all. And so he casts away the one and only identity he has. When you think about him, Fay Wangfang, in comparison to Oma, who ends up having an identity outside of his own revenge and goals, it just goes to show just how big of a difference there is between their two characters. And I think it's further enhanced by his fight against Wakatsuki. One, because Wakatsuki is an Oma, right? And so he's sort of trapped into fighting someone that he really isn't interested in. But if he were to fight against Oma, it would give, well, one, Fay would destroy Oma, but two, it would make it seem as if he actually has a shot at assimilating into the identity that is the tiger's vessel, but that's not even possible. But the worst part is that Fay's character, in terms of him basically running a race he can never win because of Nico and his deception, is sort of paralleled in his fight against Wakatsuki, in which he really doesn't win. He doesn't lose, but at the same time, it seems like at some point, he just can't overcome Wakatsuki completely, despite the fact that Fay is actually stronger. Fay should have won against Wakatsuki, but no matter how powerful he is, like becoming the tiger's vessel, it seems as though it's just not meant to be. Fay is just not meant to defeat Waka, and it ends in a draw, a massive upset for Fay himself and, of course, the people that were reading. But that brings us to the next person who has this another crippling flaw, basically, and that is Edward Wu. Edward Wu's crippling flaw is, I think, the most frustrating, honestly, because what holds Edward back is him thinking that he's too good to do the dirty job or the necessary job he has to do to win. We see this actually from the moment he doesn't enter the tournament, the purgatory tournament. There's a good chance that if Edward had entered, well, there might have been a fight with the Kurei clans on the spot. But if there wasn't, then Purgatory would have had a much better chance of just straight up winning. Because we know Edward is just that much more powerful than Kurei Ryan, at least at that point in time. However, he leaves such a job to one of his clones. And we see him do this exact thing over and over and over again, where even when he off-screen Ryan, he left him there, he didn't kill him. And again, as the fight, the finale of Purgatory versus the Kengan Association is happening with the war between the Westwood faction and the Kurei with the Wu clan, we see Edward constantly come close to beating them, but won't finish the job himself, because again, his power has gone to his head. This is what Uriel was talking about when he said Edward was way too strong. Not that necessarily he was the most powerful guy ever. Uriel said he could have beaten him in his prime. What makes him too powerful is that his power is giving him a false sense of security. Edward doesn't think he can fail because of how powerful he is. And as the fight goes on, he loses every single advantage he has until he has no advantage at all and is at a disadvantageous position. It is at that point that Edward finally wakes up, but by that point, it's too late. Then we go to Zai Ji. Now, Zai Ji's flaw is fairly obvious, at least in comparison to Edward and Fay's. Ji actually does not believe or have faith in his own power. That's really his crippling flaw. It might have been a flaw that was born off of his flashback, where him and the Connector and Yan and Edward all went to assault a certain base, and he worked so hard to defeat one person, but they defeated gangs of other people. You could say his confidence was shattered at that point, but from that point onwards, he leaves all the important stuff. He puts all of his faith into the power of his minions. And usually when Zaiji's at his most confident, it is when his minions are with him, like in chapter 50, where it's one of the very few panels where Zaiji is standing up straight and he seems confident because his minions are with him. But whenever he is alone, or he isn't with his minions, we get to see his posture change. And this is the more subtle way it manifests itself. In other ways, we get to see how much of a coward it makes him, and how much potential G is actually squandering by not working hard enough on his own power. And we see this weakness all the more with his fight against Koga, someone who has put in the work to make his power more stronger and has basically faith in the power and capabilities he has. And there is a world where if Zaiji had stuck to his martial arts, that he could have won against someone like Koga. But that doesn't happen in the fight, and it ultimately is the reason why he loses to someone like Koga. But now that we have their flaws outlined, flaws in a character ain't the end all be all, especially for an antagonist. Let's be honest, right? What should basically pull an antagonist over the edge is just how much they push the protagonists. Really, at the end of the day, what makes a well-written antagonist, these are antagonists basically, how well do they do the job of pushing the main characters? And all of them, including, surprisingly, right, when I had to do their video essays, I realized just how much all of them push the main characters. Like, Fay and Edward is sort of easy to think of because, again, they're just so devastating as opponents. Like, Wakatsuki against Fay is literally just trying to survive. At some point, it's not even about winning for Wakatsuki. It's about not losing. And that just goes to show just how devastating Fay was. To where Wakatsuki is like trying to survive this fight. He's trying to outlast Fay. He knows Fay can't do this forever, but he's getting his ass handed to him. This fight between Fay and Wakatsuki is one of the most bloodiest fights I think I've ever seen in Kengan Omega. Maybe not Ashura, but definitely in Omega. It is one of the most bloodiest fights, with Fay literally using his blood as an actual attack. With Edward, Edward takes out one of the most important characters in Kengan, which is Uryo, and he off-screens Ryan. Like, it takes the combined effort of the Kure and Wu clan. And even then, the reason why they win is because of Edward's own ignorance and just neglecting to see reality for what it was. But for the most part, Edward was putting in work. He was pushing the main characters. Most people thought that the Kore and Wu clan weren't gonna win. That's how good of a job Edward was doing in this category. And then there's Zaiji, the most surprising one. I still remember chapter 50. Chapter 50 I think is one of the best chapters in the series. And one of the reasons it's one of the best chapters is because of just how much tension Zaiji and his minions pulled off. Koga was basically fighting a losing battle at that point, or what seemed like a losing battle. He does beat all of Zaiji's minions, but he takes massive damage in the process. And it seems as though Yamashita, it might be it, where Yamashita's like, oh my god, no one's coming to save me, I'm actually just done. And that sort of emotional feel can only be attributed to Zaiji and what Zaiji had done. Now granted, Zaiji doesn't challenge the protagonist nearly as much in the future. He seems like a joke. But that's because at this point in time, actually if I remember correctly, he loses his minions at this point in time, right? He no longer has his minions with him. He chills with Eddie for a bit and then goes to Yan afterwards, after the whole Purgatory versus Kengan. So Zaiji no longer has his quote-unquote power at this point, right? So he's no longer a threat. But again, on the character front, by Kengan standards, I think they hold up pretty well. Their characters are consistently, and I would argue, well written from that point. But what makes them, you could say, push them over the edge by Kengan standards to where I think they're some of the best characters in Kengan is just how good of antagonists they are, right? How well they push the boundaries of the protagonists. And just how much of hype there was around them at various points in time. Like, even G had hype at some point because of his hidden potential that was revealed at that point. Only for, everyone to wake up again and realize, no, Zaiji's a rat. But overall, I think they serve their purpose well, and they were written quite deliberately and carefully, to where I think they hold up all the more better upon a reread of their character or an analysis of their character. And yeah, that's it. That's the conclusion. That's why Fay, Edward, and Zaiji are well-written characters, at least by Kengan standards in general, right? They seem to hold up fairly well. But yeah, that's it. Don't forget to like, sub, all that fun stuff. And until next time, take it easy.